What do you do when a hurricane kills 8,000 people in your city, the highest point on your island is 9 feet above sea level, and the storm surge that killed them was 15 feet? The city of Galveston, Texas, answered that question in 1901 with the most audacious engineering decision in American history. They did not abandon the island, they did not relocate to the mainland, they did not accept the geography that had made the disaster possible. They decided to raise the entire city, every building, every street, every streetcar track, every fire hydrant, every water pipe, every sewer line, every fence, every tree that could be saved was lifted into the air on hand-turned jackscrews and timber supports, while workers pumped millions of cubic yards of dredge sand underneath, filling the ground beneath the city to a new elevation, then lowering the buildings onto new foundations at a height that the storm surge of 1900 could not have reached. 500 city blocks, over 2,156 buildings, 16.3 million cubic yards of sand, 7 years of continuous construction. And the people of Galveston lived in their houses the entire time, walking to work and to church and to the grocery store on wooden catwalks built 8 to 10 feet above the slow-draining ground, while the sand settled beneath them and the city rose around them like a stage set being built underneath an audience that refused to leave. I went looking for the machines that did this. What I found was a construction operation so large and so strange that it has no parallel in American engineering history, executed with 4 German-built hopper dredges, a canal cut through the center of the city, a network of discharge pipelines running down residential streets, and an army of laborers turning jackscrews by hand, a quarter turn at a time, raising entire neighborhoods into the air 1 inch at a time, because the alternative was to surrender the city to the Gulf of Mexico. Galveston Island sits in the Gulf of Mexico, roughly 2 miles off the Texas coast and 50 miles southeast of Houston. The island is a barrier island, a strip of sand 29 miles long and roughly 2 miles wide, flat and low, and exposed to every storm that crosses the Gulf between June and November. In 1900, Galveston was the richest city in Texas and one of the busiest ports in the United States. Cotton bales, by the hundreds of thousands, moved through the Galveston wharves on their way to textile mills in the eastern United States and in England. Grain and cattle followed the same route. The city had electric streetcars, telephone service, electric lighting, paved streets, a commercial district that rivaled any city its size in the South, and a population just under 38,000. The city also had the highest per capita income in Texas, a thriving tourist trade, and an opera house. What it did not have was elevation. The highest natural point on the island was 8.7 feet above sea level. The lowest was barely above the waterline of Galveston Bay. The entire island was a sand flat, deposited by the Gulf, exposed to the Gulf, and defended from the Gulf by nothing. On the morning of Saturday, September 8, 1900, Isaac Klein, the chief of the Galveston office of the United States Weather Bureau, drove his horse-drawn buggy through the neighborhoods closest to the Gulf Beach, warning residents that a storm was approaching from the south. Klein had received a hurricane warning from the central office in Washington the previous day. He had also, 9 years earlier, in 1891, published a statement in the Galveston Daily News claiming that it would be impossible for any cyclone to create a storm wave that could materially injure the city of Galveston. He had opposed a proposal to build a seawall to protect the island from storm surge, arguing that such a structure was unnecessary. Those words would follow him for the rest of his life. By early afternoon on September 8th, the wind at the Galveston Weather Bureau office had reached hurricane force. The barometric pressure was dropping rapidly. The Gulf of Mexico was rising over the beach and into the streets on the south side of the island. Rain fell in horizontal sheets. By late afternoon, Galveston Bay on the north side of the island was also rising, pushed by the wind, until the Gulf surge from the south and the bay surge from the north met in the middle of the city. By evening, the full force of the storm crossed the island. The sustained winds were estimated at 145 miles per hour. The storm surge reached 15.7 feet above mean low tide. The highest point in Galveston was 8.7 feet. The water covered every square foot of the island. There was no dry ground anywhere on Galveston Island on the night of September 8th, 1900. The storm surge did not simply flood the houses closest to the Gulf. It shattered them. The wooden structures along the beach were torn apart by the wave action and the wind, and the wreckage of those houses, the lumber, the nails, the furniture, the slate roofing, the iron stoves, the pianos, the bodies of the people who had been inside them became a battering ram that the surge drove inland, smashing everything in its path. The debris accumulated into a wall, a compacted mass of wreckage 2 stories high in places, that formed across the south side of the city. The debris wall acted as an unintentional levee, absorbing some of the surge energy and preventing the full force of the wave from reaching the northern blocks. The wall saved some portion of the city. The wall was made of the remains of houses and the remains of people. Some of the survivors who climbed onto the debris wall to escape the rising water later reported feeling bodies beneath them in the wreckage, shifting as the water moved. Isaac Klein's house on the south side of the island was among those destroyed. His wife, Cora, who was pregnant, was killed when the house collapsed into the surge. Klein and his brother Joseph survived by clinging to wreckage and were carried by the water across the island. Klein's 3 young daughters survived with them. The body of Cora Klein was found weeks later, identified by her engagement ring. Between 6,000 and 12,000 people were killed in the storm. The figure most commonly cited in official reports is 8,000. The exact count was never established because the storm surge carried bodies into the Gulf of Mexico and across Galveston Bay and into the mainland marshes, and many were never recovered. In the days after the storm, the scale of the dead overwhelmed every available method of disposal. Bodies were loaded onto barges by work crews, taken into the Gulf, weighted with iron and stone, and dumped overboard. The Gulf brought them back. The tides deposited the bodies on the beaches. The work crews collected them again. Galveston abandoned burial at sea and resorted to cremation. Funeral pyres of lumber and railroad ties burned on the island for weeks, the smoke visible from the mainland, the smell carried across Galveston Bay by the prevailing wind. Donations poured in from across the country and from overseas. Clara Barton, the 78-year-old founder of the American Red Cross, arrived on September 17th with a team of relief workers. Money came from millionaires in New York, from black churches in Georgia, from a girl in Chicago who sent 10 cents, from the German Turnverein of St. Louis, from the Rough and Ready Fire Company of Montrose, Pennsylvania, from Sunday school classes that collected pennies and nickels and mailed them to Texas. Over $1.25 million in relief donations were received. The city that had been the pride of the Texas coast was leveled. The rail bridges connecting the island to the mainland were destroyed. The telegraph lines were severed. The port was crippled. Over 3,600 homes were completely demolished. Every remaining structure on the island suffered some degree of damage. 10,000 people, roughly 1 in 4 residents, were left homeless. Investors who had been considering Galveston as a commercial hub turned to Houston instead. The storm of 1900 ended the golden era of Galveston and redirected the economic trajectory of the entire Texas Gulf Coast toward the inland city 50 miles to the northwest. But Galveston did not die. And what it did next is the reason I went looking for these records. In 1901, the city appointed a board of 3 engineers to develop a plan to protect Galveston from future hurricane storm surge. The board's recommendation had 2 components. The first was a seawall along the Gulf of Mexico shoreline, 17 feet above mean low tide, 16 feet thick at its base, constructed of reinforced concrete on timber pilings with a 4-foot square riprap apron of granite blocks extending 27 feet outward from the toe of the wall. Construction of the seawall began in 1902. The scale of the materials required was staggering: 5,200 railway carloads of crushed granite, 1,800 carloads of sand, 1,000 carloads of cement, 1,200 carloads of round wooden pilings, 4,000 carloads of wooden sheet pilings, 3,700 carloads of stone riprap, and 5 carloads of reinforcing steel. The original wall stretched 3 miles along the Gulf front. It would eventually be extended to 10 miles. The second recommendation was the one that defied belief. The engineers proposed to raise the grade of the entire city, not just the seawall, not just the streets near the beach. The entire city, from the Gulf shoreline to the bay waterfront, would be elevated. The elevation at the seawall on the Gulf side would match the wall's height at roughly 17 feet above mean low tide. The elevation on the bay side, to the north, would be raised to approximately 8 feet. The city would slope gradually from south to north, from 17 feet to 8 feet, creating a drainage grade that would channel future storm water toward the bay rather than allowing it to pool in the streets. Every building, every utility, every piece of urban infrastructure within the 500-block footprint of the city would have to be raised to the new grade. The sand to fill the city would be dredged from the harbor entrance between the jetties, which had the additional benefit of deepening the shipping channel for commercial vessels. If you have a photograph in your family's collection of a house on stilts in Galveston, or a building lifted into the air with daylight visible beneath it, or a wooden catwalk running above a street that is buried in wet sand, subscribe if you want to see what I find next in these records. The contract for the grade raising was awarded to Godhart and Bates, a Dutch-German engineering firm that operated 4 state-of-the-art steel hopper dredges built at their plant in Germany. The dredges were self-loading, self-propelled, and self-discharging, meaning they could scoop sand from the harbor floor into their own hoppers, steam under their own power to the discharge point, and pump the sand through pipelines to the fill area without requiring any external equipment. Unlike traditional dredges that could only drop their contents in place, the Godhart and Bates machines could dispense fill over long distances through shore pipe, which made them uniquely suited to the task of pumping sand from the harbor into the interior of a city. The 4 dredges were named the Home, the Leviathan, the Triton, and the Nereus, the Second. A 5th dredge, the Texas, was lost at sea on December 24, 1904, before it could begin work on the grade raising. In July 1904, the dredges began digging the canal. The canal ran 3 miles from Galveston Bay near the inner end of the South Jetty and then turned east and south into the interior of the city, running along the length of the seawall through the residential district. The canal was 20 feet deep, 200 feet wide, and lined with timber pilings driven into the sand to prevent the fill from washing back into the channel. 2 turning basins were excavated, one at Avenue N and a half and 14th Street, and the other between 31st and 33rd Streets on Avenue P and a half. The turning basins allowed the dredges to reverse direction within the canal without backing out the entire length. A drawbridge was constructed at 23rd Street to allow wagon traffic and pedestrians to cross the canal. Approximately 350 houses had to be temporarily relocated to clear the canal route. The canal ran through the middle of the residential district. The dredges steamed through it, past front porches and side yards and churches and corner stores. Steel-hulled vessels carrying thousands of tons of sand from the harbor to the streets of the city, their discharge pipes snaking from the canal into the neighborhoods on either side. The first dredge to arrive in Galveston was the Home. The Leviathan followed in December 1904. The process of filling the city worked in quarter-mile square sections. Each section was enclosed in an earthen dike, a temporary levee built of compacted fill that contained the sand and water within the section being raised. Inside the dike, every structure was disconnected from its utilities, water lines cut, sewer lines capped, gas lines disconnected, electrical wires removed, streetcar tracks detached from their beds, fire hydrants uncoupled from the mains. Then the jacking began. Workers dug beneath the foundations of each building and installed heavy timber cribbing under the floor joists and sill plates. Industrial building jacks, the same screw-driven mechanical jacks used in railroad bridge work and heavy construction, were positioned at intervals beneath the cribbing. The jacks were turned by hand, a quarter turn at a time, by crews of laborers working in coordination around the perimeter and beneath the interior load-bearing walls of the structure, lifting the building off its foundation in increments of a fraction of an inch. The building rose, an inch, 2 inches, 6 inches, a foot, Timber supports were inserted beneath the building at the new height, while additional jacks were repositioned lower for the next lift. The process was repeated, lift by lift, support by support, until the building reached the target elevation for that section of the city, which ranged from a few inches in the northern blocks near the bay to as much as a 17-foot raise in the southern blocks near the seawall. At the full 17-foot raise, a one-story house was suspended nearly 2 full stories above the original ground, resting on a forest of timber cribbing, with daylight and open air visible beneath the floor where the yard had been. The most extraordinary single lift was St. Patrick's Catholic Church on 35th Street. The church was a brick and stone structure weighing 3,000 tons. It was raised 5 feet off its foundation using 700 hand-turned jackscrews positioned around the perimeter and beneath the interior columns, operated by a crew that coordinated the quarter-turn increments to prevent the structure from cracking or shifting unevenly. Services continued on schedule, while the church was suspended in the air on timber and steel. The congregation walked up temporary wooden stairs to the front entrance, which was 5 feet higher than it had been the week before, and the priest celebrated Mass while the sand slurry was being pumped beneath the building by the discharge pipes from the canal. St. Patrick's is still standing on 35th Street today. The 5-foot raise is invisible from the street. The church sits on the ground as though it has always been there, at the elevation it was moved to in 1904 on the sand that was pumped beneath it from Galveston Harbor. Once the buildings in a section were jacked to the target height and supported on temporary cribbing and timber pilings, the dredges went to work. The Holm or the Leviathan or the Triton or the Nereus II steamed into the canal from the bay, its hoppers loaded with a slurry of sand and seawater scooped from the harbor channel between the jetties. The dredge docked at the nearest discharge station and began pumping. The slurry was forced through a network of steel pipelines, 8 to 12 inches in diameter, that ran from the docking station along the streets and alleys of the section being filled. The mixture poured from the pipe ends and spread across the enclosed section, a river of wet sand and salt water flowing around the timber supports, settling into every depression and hollow in the old ground surface, rising slowly as more slurry was pumped in. The water drained through gaps in the dike walls and into surrounding drainage channels. The sand remained. The process took days for each discharge cycle. Multiple cycles were required to bring each section to the target grade. When the fill dried and compacted to the correct elevation, new foundations were constructed on top of the sand, and the buildings were lowered from their temporary supports onto their new bases and reconnected to the utility grid. The entire city lived through this process for 7 years. People remained in their raised houses while the sand was pumped beneath them. They walked to work on a network of wooden catwalks, temporary boardwalks fastened to the tops of the raised buildings and strung between blocks, connecting sections that had been raised to sections that had not yet been filled. The catwalks ran 8 to 10 feet above the original ground level in the most heavily raised sections near the seawall. Children walked to school on these boardwalks. Groceries were delivered along these boardwalks. Doctors made house calls on these boardwalks. The city functioned at a reduced and precarious level on a network of temporary wooden pathways suspended above a construction site that covered 500 city blocks and was saturated with standing salt water that drained slowly through sand and through the dike walls over days and weeks. The catwalks shifted constantly as sections were completed and new sections were enclosed, and the fill moved across the city from south to north, the rising ground chasing the workers and the dredge pipes and the jacking crews, block by block, year by year, like a slow tide of sand filling the city from the Gulf side toward the bay. Homeowners were responsible for the cost of raising their own buildings and fences. The city and the taxpayers funded the infrastructure, the dikes, the dredging, the sand, the pipelines, the canal, the turning basins, the drawbridge at 23rd Street. But the individual cost of hiring a jacking crew, building temporary supports, and constructing a new foundation fell on the property owner. Many could not afford it. The families who could not pay for the jacking crews simply moved to their second floors and allowed the first floor to be filled with sand. The sand came in through the ground floor windows and doors and filled the parlors and the kitchens and the hallways to the level of the new grade. The family lived upstairs. The ground floor became part of the foundation. The front door that had faced the street now faced a wall of sand. A new entrance was cut into the second floor. This was not a failure of the system. This was the system working as designed. The city was being raised, and the residents who could not raise their buildings with it adapted by surrendering the lower portion of their homes to the same sand that was being pumped from the harbor. 5 years into the project, Goathart and Bates had lost over $250,000 on the Galveston contract. The cost of operating the 4 dredges, maintaining the canal and the turning basins, managing the discharge pipeline network, and coordinating with the jacking crews and the city's utility companies had exceeded every estimate the firm had submitted. Goathart and Bates went bankrupt and withdrew from Galveston, disheartened, having laid the groundwork for one of the most significant civil engineering projects in American history, but unable to finish it. The American Dredging Company was commissioned to complete the grade raising. Additional dredges were brought to the island. Additional sections were enclosed and filled. The work continued through 1910 and into 1911. The last cubic yard of sand was shoveled into place on August 8, 1910, according to Texas Highways, though final construction on buildings and foundations continued into 1911. When it was finished, the city of Galveston had been raised from its original elevation of roughly 5 to 6 feet above mean low tide to a new elevation that varied from 8 feet on the bay side to approximately 22 feet at the seawall, 500 city blocks, over 2,156 buildings, 16.3 million cubic yards of sand dredged from the harbor and pumped through steel pipelines into the streets of a city that had buried 8,000 of its residents 4 years earlier. The project is listed as a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark by the American Society of Civil Engineers. It is the largest urban grade raising operation ever completed in the United States. No American city has attempted anything comparable before or since. The seawall and the grade raising were tested 15 years after the 1900 storm. On August 17, 1915, a hurricane struck Galveston with sustained winds of 120 miles per hour and a storm surge of 11.6 feet. The 1915 storm was comparable in intensity to the hurricane that had killed 8,000 people in 1900. The seawall held. The raised grade held. The storm surge reached the base of the wall and was turned back into the Gulf. The water that overtopped the wall in places drained north across the raised city toward the bay, exactly as the engineers had designed. Property damage in the 1915 hurricane was significant. 8 people died. 8. In 1900, on the same island, at the same elevation, in a storm of comparable strength, the dead numbered 8,000. The difference between those two numbers is the seawall and the grade raising and the 16.3 million cubic yards of sand and the 2,156 buildings on hand-turned jackscrews and the 4 German dredges and the workers who operated them. I started with a question. What do you do when a hurricane kills 8,000 people in your city and the highest point on your island is 9 feet above sea level? In Galveston, the answer was that you raise the island. You cut a canal through your own streets. You steam 4 German-built hopper dredges through your own residential district past front porches and church steps. You jack 2,156 buildings into the air on hand-turned screws, a quarter turn at a time, a fraction of an inch at a time, while the congregation of St. Patrick's Church attends Sunday Mass 5 feet above where Sunday Mass was held the week before. You pump 16.3 million cubic yards of sand from the harbor through steel pipelines into the space beneath your own houses while you walk to work on wooden catwalks 10 feet above the ground. You do this for 7 years. You do this while a dredge is lost at sea on Christmas Eve. You do this while the first contractor goes bankrupt and has to be replaced. You do this while families who cannot afford to raise their houses move upstairs and let the sand fill their parlors and their kitchens and their front halls. The engineers who designed the grade raising are documented by name in the records of the American Society of Civil Engineers. The contractors, Goathart and Bates and the American Dredging Company are documented. The dredges, the Holm and the Leviathan and the Triton and the Nereus II are documented in the photograph collection of the Galveston and Texas History Center, where images show the steel-hulled vessels docked in the turning basins at 23rd Street and Avenue P, their discharge pipes snaking into the residential blocks on either side of the canal, the laborers who turned the 700 jackscrews beneath St. Patrick's Church, the men who dug beneath the foundations and installed the cribbing and operated the discharge pipelines and built the catwalks and the dikes and the turning basins, the men who did the physical work of raising a city 17 feet into the air over the course of 7 years, are in the Army Corps of Engineers records and in the contractor payroll logs. They are not in any memorial on Galveston Island. There's no plaque that names them. The city they raised is still standing at the elevation they raised it to. The names of the men who raised it are not recorded on any wall. There are more of these stories, more machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different or did not come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see what happened when France sent the largest fleet of dredges ever assembled into the jungle of Panama, and the jungle sent them back, that video's on screen now.